Hey there, welcome to Broadband News. Rick Easy here with Quorum. I wanted to take a look at the new restructuring policy document from the NTIA on Bead. I looked at it Friday, I did a little stream on that Friday and jumped the gun. I looked at it, well first I didn't know it was there, and then I found it as I was doing the stream. So looked through it and had more time to look through it now and wanted to walk through the document, just comment on it, bring up some questions I have that I think are going to be some challenges with this new guidance. It will be interesting to see what the states do with this. So I want to take a look at that and be right back. Hey, thanks for joining me again. Rick Husey here with Broadband News. So let's walk through this. So this is the document. I forgot to put a link to this in the description. I'll go ahead and do that at the end of the broadcast here, but this is from the Department of Commerce. This is all around the fact that we've got a new administration. Bead program came out kind of early on in the Biden administration, and Trump administration took over. Howard Lutnick, new Secretary of Commerce, put a pause on that while they decided to give it a rigorous review. They've done that. They were always making comments that they felt like the program was not technology neutral as it should have been, they said, based on the based on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Bead legislation. I've always maintained that legislation, while it didn't specifically prioritize broadband, it talked about priority broadband projects in such a way where only really fiber was the best fit for that, at least certainly today. So we'll see that language actually in here. They quote the language from the legislation itself. So there's that. There's other stuff that I've maintained should not have been in the original notice of funding opportunity, which they're taking out. I think a lot of people will probably be happy with that. But the changes are going to be, it's going to take some time for the states to look at how they're going to implement some of these changes. So again, I wanted to just highlight some areas that I saw to kind of point out what some of the differences are. So you see here background and purpose. It says these reforms are necessary. NTIA nevertheless recognizes that stakeholders have invested significant resources participating in the Bead program since IIJA passed in 2021, so it's been that long. Accordingly, this policy notice carefully balances the work that's previously been done with necessary changes to ensure the success of the Bead program. Specifically, NTIA does not require states, that would be eligible entities, to repeat the initial stages of the program, but removes the extra legal Biden administration burdens and promotes greater competition. This targeted approach will ensure that all Americans receive the greatest benefit of the bargain and that the Bead program moves forward expeditiously. That benefit of the bargain is a phrase that Howard Lutnick used in his Senate confirmations, and now they're incorporating that into this document. Elimination of regulatory burdens. There's a widespread agreement among states, lawmakers, and industry that the superfluous requirements imposed by the Biden administration made the Bead program more complex and expensive, stifled competition, and led to reduced participation levels. I would certainly agree with that. There was stuff in there that was not really related to broadband, that were more pet kind of projects or topics for a Democrat administration, and those wound up in there. And now we've got a Republican administration that's kind of taking a lot of that stuff out, so it's interesting how there's this pull back and forth. Labor, employment, workforce development requirements. So that was one of the things that this was really difficult for states and the service providers, because if there are, it's going to be hard enough to find people all the people that are going to be needed to install broadband in all of these areas, assuming we still need to install broadband in all of these areas, because I'll talk about that later. But what does this do to the map as far as who really has broadband today? But if we were going to install broadband everywhere, and especially if we're going to be fiber everywhere where there was an unserved or underserved location, that's a lot of people you need. And if you've got extra hoops that you've got to go through, or certain people you can't hire certain people because they don't meet some requirements, that's a problem. So it says these central planning and diversity, equity, and inclusion edicts disadvantage both workers and providers. And again, if you have to have people of a certain race or whatever, that's not good either. Just get people who can do the job, especially in the rural communities if the program is intended to help. Because again, it's harder in these rural communities where you have fewer workers, so that just means you have fewer to choose from. Specifically, NTIA hereby eliminates the following sections of the NOFO: fair labor practices and highly skilled workforce, advancing equitable workforce development and job quality objectives, and civil rights and non-discrimination law compliance. So I'm sure some of these things are covered under existing laws, like you can't discriminate on somebody if you're going to hire them based on their race, religion, creed, sexual orientation, or anything like that. So that's kind of already there. So that should not be an issue. But again, if you have these extra hoops that people have to run through to prove that they're doing something, or to make sure that they're hiring only certified people that have, part of a labor union, those kinds of things, when you can hire a skilled person who can do the job, this would make it easier. The contracting with small and minority businesses, women's business enterprises, and labor surplus area firms section is also eliminated. So these are things that are not in the Bead legislation, and they are taking those out. They were put in the Notice of Funding Opportunities, so they're taking those things out, and that will help, I think. I think most people, as it says here, most people, when I say people, most of the subgrantees, potential subgrantees, the internet service providers, as well as probably a lot of the states, are happy that this is gone, because it's just more stuff, more burdens. They've already, unfortunately, put a lot into this trying to meet these things. So there's a question there is how many cycles have already been spent. Climate change requirements. NTIA hereby eliminates the climate change or climate resilience section of the NOFO and the related initial proposal and final proposal requirements for that. Again, this is something that really should not have been in a broadband bill. Subgrantees shall satisfy the statutory requirement to incorporate best practices defined by NTIA for ensuring reliability and resilience of broadband infrastructure, including from natural disasters, wildfires, flooding, tornadoes, hurricanes, as applicable, as well as cybersecurity best practices. So that's good. So that's really the resilience of the network is it resilient to these kinds of natural disasters? And I think on one side they think, well, these natural disasters are going to happen more and more often because of climate change, but they're taking the approach here that just make sure that you can be resilient if these types of things happen. And then again, cybersecurity best practices is also important for this. Open access, net neutrality. NTIA hereby eliminates the non-statutory requirements in the NOFO related to open access and net neutrality. Specifically, they required states not impose data usage caps on any plans offered over a funded network or impose unjust or unreasonable network management practices. NTIA further eliminates the interconnection requirements in a wholesale access section of the NOFO. So yeah, I think in the NOFO originally there was, if you're creating your network, it was especially, I think, on maybe a middle mile network, or I think even if you were doing a last mile network, you needed to make that open to anybody that wanted to do their own service over your infrastructure that you built. I think that was for sure on middle mile where you had to let anybody connect up to it. I can't recall if that was in the last mile stuff, but certainly somebody who's going to fund a network doesn't want to spend all the money to fund that and have other people ride that unless they particularly set it up as an open access network. Although subgrantees must still satisfy the statutory requirement to include interspersed conduit access points at regular and short intervals. So that's in there, I guess, that they need to have these conduit access points, but they're not going to be forced or required to have open access on that network that they build. NTIA eliminates the conduit access point section of the NOFO to the extent it imposes additional obligations beyond those in the statute. Local coordination and stakeholder engagement. There was a lot of this that's just already been done. It's kind of sunk cost. The original, this is why broadband offices were doing these road shows, visiting every county in a state and talking to local folks and saying, hey, what do you need? How can we help? That kind of stuff. Some of that was good. You want to know what's going on in different areas, but it was a significant portion of what had to be done by the broadband offices on the early stages of this. I don't know how much this is going to help, but NTIA hereby eliminates the non-statutory requirements in the NOFO related to local coordination and stakeholder engagement. Specifically, they eliminate the local coordination and public notice sections of the NOFO and the related initial proposal and final proposal content requirements that dramatically expand on the statutory local coordination requirements. IIJA statutorily requires eligible entities to adopt local coordination requirements established by NTIA. NTIA concludes that an eligible entity, I'm going to say state when I remember, Satisfy this requirement by certifying that it observed the final proposal public comment requirements and received plans submitted by political subdivisions up until submission of the final proposal to NTIA. Non-traditional broadband providers, here's where it gets a little sticky. NTIA, well, this not so much. Actually, it's more the technology, but this is about like munis and that kind of thing. So NTIA hereby eliminates requirements in the NOFO that favored non-traditional broadband providers such as municipalities or political subdivisions by forcing eligible entities to justify awards to traditional providers when a competing proposal from a non-traditional provider was submitted. So what this was about is the Biden administration, it was broadband access, equity, access, and deployment. I guess it was more the affordability part of it. So Biden administration was trying to make broadband more affordable, and they figured one way to do that was to engage not-for-profit kinds of organizations. What I mean by that is it could be a electric co-op. When I say not-for-profit, in other words, it's owned by the members. Their primary goal is not to make profits, it's to serve their members. Or if it's a municipality, their primary goal is not to make a profit. They want to make sure they cover their costs, and they're serving their community like a utility. Of course, they still got to make a profit to be able to keep the business running and market the business, those kinds of things. But that's the difference. So they're saying now that you can't give those organizations a heads up or a head start and say that if you've got a bid from a non-traditional and a traditional, like let's say a phone company or a cable company, a fiber operator, or something like that, you can't make you can't give the benefit to the non-traditional, is what it's saying. So that makes sense. Middle class affordability plan. Yeah, this was not in there. So NTIA hereby eliminates the NOFO requirement for eligible entities to develop, implement, and provide updates on a middle class affordability plan. So that would mean that's kind of trying to control the prices of not just a low cost plan, but something that would apply to middle class, which is really going to be getting your normal broadband service. I mean, middle class and wealthy are going to be buying the same kind of broadband service. So really then you're talking about controlling prices at the whole gamut there. So you've got low cost service option, NTI, and there was a low cost service option in the legislation. So it says NTIA hereby eliminates the affordability and low-cost plans section of the NOFO and the related initial proposal and final proposal requirements. So they're trying to stick to just what is in the legislation here. IIJA requires Bead subgrantees to offer not less than one low-cost broadband service option for eligible subscribers. It didn't really expand much on that. It just says they have to offer a low-cost option. So what does that mean? And that's what the first NOFO was trying to figure out, and how to do that on a state-by-state basis. So IIJA also clearly prohibits NTIA from regulating the rates charged for broadband service. So you've got those two competing goals. You want a low-cost broadband service, but you don't want to regulate the rates that the internet service providers are going to charge. So how do you do that? NTIA finds that by offering a model low-cost service option with specific dollar amounts and requiring states to set a specific rate in order to be approved by NTIA, the Biden administration engaged in improper rate regulation in the NOFO. So they're saying that, again, you can have a low-cost option, but you can't regulate the rate. Bead subgrantees must still comply with the statutory provision to offer at least one low-cost service option, but NTIA hereby prohibits states from explicitly or implicitly setting the rate that a subgrantee must offer. To be clear, NTIA will only approve final proposals that include low-cost options proposed by the subgrantees themselves. Finally, NTIA also hereby modifies the eligible subscriber definition below to align it with the FCC's Lifeline program and other federal assistance programs. So that's explained here. So it talks about the eligible subscriber. Again, it's basically if you qualify for the Lifeline program, then you could qualify for this. So you see here, eligible subscriber means any household seeking to subscribe to broadband internet access service that is eligible for the FCC's Lifeline program. Technology neutrality. Here's where it gets sticky. So all broadband technologies that meet the performance requirements of IIJA and the NOFO must be eligible to participate in the Bead program. So the IIJA, the Bead legislation, says that anything less than 25 by 3 is considered unserved. Anything between 25 by 3 and less than 100 by 20 is considered underserved. Anything over 100 by 20 is considered served. So that's that. But of course, that is not really where we want to be in this country if we're going to be spending money on broadband. So the whole point of this was to be providing service, and this is my opinion, but I think it's based on the whole reason that we did this, right? The whole point of the Bead program was to be able to get people that are in, certainly to provide those folks that don't have, that are underserved or unserved, 25 by 3, less than 100 by 20, that kind of thing, to give them better broadband. But it's not necessarily to give them broadband that is not really that much better. If somebody's today got just under 100 by 20, giving them 200 by 20 is not much better, and it doesn't do much for the future, really. It's a little bit better, and it does nothing for the future because it's not going to be much better very longer, if that makes sense. So here's where none of this makes sense. Here's where, like I say, this is sticky. This is going to be hard for the states to figure out what to do. It's very subjective in that they did not, unlike the first NOFO that said, let's talk about, the first NOFO I think was right. It said, let's talk about the technologies that we want to take into the future and leave out those that are not going to be able to take us there. Those are not, if we're going to spend money, we don't want to spend on the technology that today is really not a whole lot better than, let's say, unserved or underserved, excuse me. So it's not a whole lot better than underserved. It's better, but it's not a whole lot better. So why would we spend money on that to be able to subsidize that? So that is the problem that I'm seeing here. So the NOFO limited priority broadband projects to those using end-to-end fiber. And that's true in the sense that the Notice Funding Opportunity said a priority broadband project, the way we're going to define that is it's going to be a fiber end-to-end, even though that's not specified in the Infrastructure Act. And we'll see here in a minute how it is specified in the Infrastructure Act. But you'll also see why I think fiber was the intent of the Act. So, again, it specifies end-to-end fiber. In doing so, the NOFO relegated other capable technologies, including terrestrial wireless and low Earth orbit satellite services, to a third-tier status, limiting the ability of those technologies to fully participate in the NOFO subgrantee selection process and denying the taxpayer the benefit of the bargain via increased competition. Now, it did not, it didn't eliminate them from the process in the sense that if a state saw that fiber was going to be way too expensive, then they could opt to use an alternative technology like fixed wireless. Did have to be licensed or a combination of licensed and unlicensed fixed wireless, or satellite. They could do satellite. Now, if a state had way too much money, then they could be spending lots and lots of money for a fiber connection, ridiculous amounts of money to connect up, let's say, 4 or 5 homes in an area, hundreds of thousands of dollars and per location. We'll see, I think they've referenced that in here. So there's that as well. So that is a little bit crazy. But for the most part, a lot of these locations where it's not that crazy a price, you'd want to be doing fiber. But this makes it, again, very confusing for states on what they should be doing if now suddenly they have to take bids from satellite operators and unlicensed fixed wireless in areas that that really are served today. I'll get to this in a minute. In my opinion, if I'm looking at this, the way I'm looking at this, every single location in the United States now has broadband. If every single location in the United States can get over 100 by 20 with, let's say, low Earth orbit satellite, right? So this is how they changed it. They said, we're going to go with 100 by 20. That's what we're saying. If the service can provide better than 100 by 20, then they can compete for BEAD funding. Well, if that service is already available to every single broadband serviceable location in the country at over 100 by 20, and if BEAD says anything over 100 by 20 is served, then we have no more need for broadband, right? Everybody is served. So to give you an example, I looked at several locations. Let me see if I can make this bigger. I looked at several locations on the FCC broadband map. And this is a location in Gordon, Georgia. We have a call center down in that area. And I think we have good broadband. But, as you get to the outskirts here, I picked a location. And you can see what you've got is you got basically satellite and you got DSL. So you got Viasat satellite here for business. You've got Usenet satellite. You've got Viasat here for residential. You got Starlink, right? So you've got satellite. You've got Windstream DSL. So let's see what Starlink says that they can offer 220 by 30. So this is over the definition in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This is considered served. If you were going to say that satellite counts, this is considered served. I looked at other locations in Georgia. I looked at a few other locations in random places in the United States, and this is what Starlink reports. So that means every single location, I didn't look at every single location, but every single location I looked at is considered served. And these would be locations like this, where all you have is satellite and maybe DSL, or maybe a fixed wireless service that's not very fast. So here's the problem with this is you're saying satellite can compete in these bids, but if satellite can compete and therefore they're considered reliable broadband, as the way it was in the NOFO before, then you don't need to fund any more broadband. It's already here. People can get it. Maybe they can't afford it. Maybe that's another question, but people can get it. So this doesn't make any sense to me. So that's why none of this is going to be really hard to figure out. Let's see. Here's the benefit of the bargain thing again. So NOFO, yeah. And then fiber, in doing so, they relegated the other technologies to a third tier, which they did, which I think needed to be there. Limiting the ability of these technologies to fully participate in the NOFO and denying the taxpayer the benefit of the bargain via increased competition. Well, again, there's no taxpayer money that needs to be spent if the broadband's already there. Why bother funding broadband if everybody in the country? And I challenge all of you to go out and check different locations. Maybe in some areas Starlink reports something lower. None of these technology limitations are in statute, and they undermine the ability of eligible entities or states to select not only the most cost-effective technologies, but also those that are much quicker to deploy and which may be better suited to a given state's particular circumstances. All of that's not true, because all of that in the original Notice of Funding Opportunity and guidance that was added later for satellite allowed the states to consider these other technologies if fiber was too expensive. So that's not true. This is a straw man. That was not the case. This is just complicating things by making satellite something that you can offer, put on the same level as fiber, because then if you do that, then everybody has broadband today. Priority broadband projects. It says IAGA requires eligible entities to prioritize funding for priority broadband projects, and here's how it is in the statute. So statute defines that as provide broadband service that meets speed, latency, reliability, consistency, and quality of service and related criteria as the Assistant Secretary shall determine. So we got a new Assistant Secretary, and they've determined 100 by 20. Anything over that is considered a priority broadband project as opposed to what it was before. And then here's the thing that, again, in my opinion, the intent of Congress and those that wrote the original legislation was that this be fiber, because it says, ensure that the network built by the project can easily scale speeds over time to meet the evolving connectivity needs of households and businesses, and support the deployment of 5G successor wireless technologies and other advanced services. There's no way, number one, that satellite's going to be meeting the evolving connectivity needs of households and businesses anytime soon, if ever, compared to what fiber can do today. Satellite today, regardless of what Elon Musk and Starlink report on that broadband map, they're not consistently getting over 100 megabits per second on the downstream, and even less consistently getting over 20 megabits per second on the upstream. So it's not consistent at all. So that would be a reason that if I were a state, I would say, it's just not consistent enough where we're comfortable doing that. There would have to be speed tests that showed, in my opinion, that they would do well over that in order to be able to say that, most of the time you're going to get over 100 by 20. And the other thing here, again, supporting 5G or successor wireless technologies. Well, 5G is faster than satellite, so how could satellite support 5G service? That doesn't make any sense. So that's, again, another reason why I believe that really what we're talking about here is fiber backhaul, for example, supporting these 5G services. The NOFO limited the definition of one technology and in fiber. The definition of priority broadband project as stated in NOFO is hereby stricken and is replaced with the following. So it's interesting, they have to leave this in. So they say the term priority broadband project means a project that provides broadband service at speeds of no less than 100 by 20, has a latency of less than or equal to 100 milliseconds. That's all in the legislation. And this, again, is in the legislation, so they keep this in here and easily scale speeds over time to meet the evolving connectivity, et cetera, what we just read. So they had to keep that in there. So having to keep that in there, does this give states some leeway to say, again, that they don't want to do satellite because they don't feel that it meets the second part of that definition? Any applicant may seek to have the eligible entity treat its application as a priority broadband project regardless of the technology used. The applicant's project, however, must still meet the required speed and latency standards set forth in this statute in the NOFO. I think latency is no problem. Speed, again, is a little bit iffy, whether satellite can get over that or whether certain wireless, unlicensed wireless can get over that. And, again, demonstrate that it meets the additional statutory criteria, including that it can easily scale. So, again, it has to meet those. Applicants must provide supporting documentation sufficient for the state to assess the network application and determine that the proposed network architecture for each specific project area meets this standard. So, again, that could be considered very subjective. What is going to evolve to meet the connectivity needs of households and businesses? Well, let's look at fiber. Fiber today, pretty much gigabit symmetrical is considered kind of the standard. Nobody really needs a gig up, but a gig down is a lot of people can get it. They like getting a gig down. All the streaming that people are doing, it's great to have a gig service. It's great to have gig service if you're streaming like I am and going out to the internet as opposed to bringing stuff in. But fiber today, you've got XGS-PON that's doing 10 gig, then you've got 25 gig PON. That's all possible today. And again, satellite struggles to get over the current requirement of 100 by 20 just to be served, or not underserved or unserved. So I think we can say that the states have some leeway here that should be able to make a case. They should be able to make a case that these areas that I've highlighted in green are more important than trying to get satellite out to everybody. And again, why do we need satellite if they already meet 100 by 20? I don't know. None of this makes sense. They can't exclude that if the project can do that. NTIA, this is interesting again. So the state could try to make their case, but NTIA reserves the right to reverse a state's determination that a project does or does not meet the standard for a priority broadband project if such determination is unreasonable. So maybe there's something there where maybe there's a balance between the state and the federal government where the state can say, in these areas we really want to do fiber. We're not comfortable with satellite. However, in these other areas that fiber is too expensive, we'd like to do satellite, even though we're not really sure it's going to be great, but we'll consider it as a secondary option in these areas. That's exactly what we had in the first NOFO, was they wanted to do fiber where it could be afforded, and areas where it couldn't be afforded, we're going to go ahead and do satellite or fixed wireless or something like that. The difference is there's no high cost threshold now. And I suppose maybe, again, if there's a good balance, maybe the government could come in and say, federal government could say, it's fine, fiber is fine in these areas, but these areas that are unreasonably expensive, we don't want to waste the money there, and you've got to do satellite there. So maybe they can pick and choose between them, and there'll be some kind of a negotiation process where they come together. Technologies eligible for participation. Again, fiber optic, cable, LEO satellite, and terrestrial fixed wireless. It's interesting that this does not mention DSL, which is smart because the first one mentioned DSL. Why would you put DSL and call that an eligible service? DSL can't come close and will never come close. It's dead, basically. Nobody's doing that. So it doesn't mention DSL. The benefit of the bargain round. So here's, again, this is where it's a burden on the states. NTIA is requiring states to conduct at least one additional subgrantee selection round for every BEAD eligible location. They call it the benefit of the bargain round. All subgrantee selection conducted after the release of this policy notice must comply with the terms of this policy notice. And, for example, here in Georgia, the first round, they've only done one round. Yeah, only one round. The first round was fiber only. And what they were trying to do, it was a county by county project area. So a internet service provider could submit an application if they were going to submit an application, it had to be the whole county and it had to be fiber in the first round. The second round, what Georgia was going to do was say, okay, we have certain areas that we didn't get bids for, and we'll look at alternative technologies there. Well, Georgia would have to redo this anyway, but they're going to be required to redo this because they have to do a second round to make sure that these other technologies are included. States must rescind all preliminary and provisional subaward selections and notify applicants that a further round of applications will be considered before final awards are made. Eligible entities must have already completed subgrantee selection, must conduct at least one benefit of the bargain round. States have 90 days to comply with the obligation outlined in this policy notice and submit a final proposal that reflects the results of the benefit of the bargain round. That's a short window. I know the states want to get this thing moving, but what we're basically saying now is they've now got to get new applications in within 90 days and get all of that put back into a proposal and sent back. So it seems like the NTIA is squeezing the states. It's kind of hurry up and wait. It's like, okay, we put this on hold. We're going to make these changes that are going to be a problem for you, and now we need you to do everything really quick. So that's unfortunate. To the extent a state has a pre-qualification process, it must be reopened to all interested applicants. Existing qualified applicants do not need to resubmit pre-qualification documentation. So if you were a fiber operator, cable operator, or whoever, and you pre-qualified, you're good. But if you were maybe someone like Starlink or Amazon for satellite, or fixed wireless, unlicensed fixed wireless that didn't qualify before, you can now go into that pre-qualification process. When an applicant elects to stand on an existing subgrantee application received prior to the publication of this policy notice, that application shall be rescored under the rubric detailed below and may be awarded during the benefit of the bargain round, but no Bead subgrantee will be permitted to recover costs to comply with the regulatory burdens eliminated in this policy notice. So if you had to do a climate change report or research or environmental impact study or whatever, if you had to do that, and if that was something that maybe you could have gotten reimbursed for in the original, you will not get reimbursed for that. That's why I'm reading that. Existing applicants may also choose to submit a new application that eliminates the cost of these regulatory burdens in anticipation of completion from additional applicants. Eligible entities must allow applicants to propose to exclude select broadband serviceable locations that the applicant determines are excessively high-cost locations from the project area or would otherwise make the project economically unviable for the technology being used. So again, I think that might impact maybe states that had specific project areas. Again, state of Georgia had by county. You had to bid for the whole county, I believe, whereas now it sounds like they're saying, a subgrantee, an applicant could take areas out that they don't want to do. Now, of course, the challenge that you have, if you do that, is the really hard areas nobody's going to want to bid. So if they, states might find out, they get the applications in, they realize, well, nobody wants to do this area. So then I guess they have to do another round and say, okay, nobody wanted to do this area. Just let us know what it's going to cost and have everybody bid and see if they get the lowest cost there. That's the only thing I can think of. Scoring rubrics, instead of establishing straightforward selection criteria focused on the efficient deployment of broadband, the Biden administration's guidelines to states were scattered and preoccupied with extraneous social policy goals. Thus, NTIA hereby revises the scoring criteria previously outlined in the NOFO to focus on minimizing the cost of deployment under the Bead program. And again, I agree with a lot of that in that those items were just causing the program's cost to go up. It was going to make it more expensive to deploy broadband and to maintain broadband. If a state determines that selecting priority broadband project would incur excessive costs, it shall select a lower cost non-priority broadband project. I don't know what that means because everything, unless that's DSL, because everything else would qualify as a priority broadband project. So whether it's fiber or fixed wireless or satellite, it's saying if the state determines that selecting one of those would incur an excessive cost, it can choose something else. I don't know what that something else would be other than, again, DSL or 2 tin cans and a string. I don't know. NTIA declines to adopt a national cost threshold over which a project would be deemed excessive. However, NTIA hereby reserves the right to reject any proposed deployment project or specific BSL connection, broadband service location connection, for which costs to deploy are excessive as determined by NTIA based on the cost characteristics of the area to be served. So I guess what they're saying is we're not going to go across the whole country and say, here's a threshold, you can't go above this, but they're going to look at the area and say, based on this area and what should be appropriate and maybe what other technologies would be, this is just way out of line. The Biden administration pursued an extreme technology bias and instructed eligible entities to set their extremely high cost per threshold or per location threshold as high as possible. And that's what they were trying to do, was to get that threshold as high as possible so that you could get fiber to as many places. And then anything that was over that threshold, then you could consider something else. So they're completely scrapping that. They're throwing that out. So since this guidance led to excessive project area costs, Nevada's extremely high cost per location threshold is set at $200,000, for example. That resulted in a final proposal that included 24 project areas with a per location cost of $100,000 or more. This is an unjust and unfair expenditure of taxpayer dollars that this administration simply will not let stand. So it is kind of shocking to think that you're going to spend $100,000 of taxpayer money to connect one location. Could be one house somewhere, let's say with fiber. And I'm sure that's what that would be fiber. That's where, again, the state maybe had too much money, allocated. And they were saying, we could give fiber to pretty much everybody. Some of them would be $100,000, but we can get it out there with this kind of money. So I guess what they're, some of this makes sense. That's kind of extreme. Eligible entities are strongly encouraged to exercise judicious cost oversight to avoid delay or denial in final proposal processing. To ensure that taxpayer dollars are protected, NTI reserves the right to reject a state's selection of a project for a subgrant if such project would impose unreasonable costs on the Bead program. And what's interesting about this is the money's been allocated by Congress. The NTIA looked at all of the broadband service locations in the country, how many were unserved or underserved, really I think it's unserved, and then how many of those were there per state, and that's how it determined how much each state got, and then the states were told how much money they would get. So all that's kind of been figured out, and it's like, okay, each state's going to get this. Now state, if you have this much money, maybe you have too much money and you can't spend it all. It sounds like what they're saying is too much money, that much fiber, or getting fiber to all those areas too expensive, use something else, and then there'll be money left over. And what they do with that, I don't know. Eligible entities shall score competing applications using the following criteria. Primary, in deciding among competing applications covering the same general project areas, states must choose the option with the lowest cost based on minimal Bead program outlay. What does that mean? Does that mean satellite? Fixed wireless? Does that mean that fiber doesn't count if it's the lowest cost outlay? I don't know. That's the primary criteria. Minimal Bead program outlay. The state must select the combination of project proposals with the lowest overall cost to the program. This may involve selecting a proposal that is not the lowest cost option for a given set of BSLs, but is part of the combination of selected projects within or with the lowest cost to the program. I have no idea what that means. When comparing competing proposals, states shall assess the total Bead funding that will be required to complete the project. For example, the total project cost minus the applicant's proposed match, and the cost of the program per location. In other words, the total Bead funding that will be required to complete the project divided by the number of BSLs the project will serve. Again, no idea what that means. Hopefully, smarter people will look at that and ask questions and see what they're getting at there. Secondary criteria. Speed deployment. Speed deployment. It's going to cost. It's going to cost more to put fiber down. It's going to take way longer to put fiber down than it is to say, okay, let's give these folks satellite, because the satellite's already up there floating around over our heads, right? So Greater consideration can be awarded to prospective subgrantees promising an earlier service provision date. Yeah. Fixed wireless is going to be faster, most likely, if you've already got towers that you can put some equipment on and hit certain areas. That's going to be faster than fiber as well. Speed of network and other technical capabilities. This is important. This is where fiber wins. Eligible entities may weigh the speed, latency, and other technical capabilities of the technologies proposed by the prospective subgrantees. Preliminary provisional subgrantees for locations where states have already identified preliminary or provisionally selected subgrantees. Those states may give additional weight to those applications in the benefit of the bargain round. So the way I'm reading that is if an application has already been put in, then they have a little bit of a step up there in that they've already gone through this process, they put in their application, and now you got other people coming in behind, so they're giving those folks that already put it in a little bit of an advantage. Maybe that's a good thing. So I think that's what that's saying. As required by IIJA, states must still ensure that subgrantees have a demonstrated record of and plans to continue compliance with federal labor and employment laws, because that is in the Act. Federal labor practices shall no longer be considered within the scoring criteria, because I don't think that is in the Act. So you have to comply with these things, but it's not part of the scoring. You can't say, well, if it's in there, that doesn't make any sense really, because if it's got to be in there anyway, then somebody should not be submitting. The application shouldn't be any good if it's not in there. So again, that confuses me. Optimizing Bead locations. States are not required to rerun their challenge process. That's a good thing. States must investigate and account for locations that do not require Bead funding. That's, I guess, maybe a final run through and seeing, okay, are we sure all these places require Bead funding? But then again, if every particular location in your state can get satellite broadband at 220 by 30 according to Starlink, are there any eligible locations anymore? So that's, again, all very confusing to me. Let's see. Eligible entities must modify Bead eligible location list to include locations no longer served due to a default or change in service area on a federal enforceable commitment where the federal entity has notified NTIA and the eligible entity of the default. And this, I think, was already taking place. So this would be like a lot of this was going on with RDOF, the Rural Development Opportunity Fund, where a lot of people bid on locations, and then of course we had this crazy inflation and supply chain problems take place, which caused a lot of default. Some people defaulted anyway. They bid way too low. Other people bid based on kind of conditions and how they'd been over the last 10 or 15 years, and suddenly they were hit with record inflation. So that was all being done, but we need to make sure that none of those locations, all of those defaulted locations, I should say, that have been taken off of the map are now being considered as locations that need to be served. But then again, if satellite's available, do they need to be served? I'm going to keep coming back to that because that's a big question. To facilitate the process, NTIA will send each eligible entity, if applicable, a list of defaulted or newly eligible locations that qualify for Bead within 14 calendar days of the issuance of this policy notice. So what do they do about satellite if it's over 100 by 20? Do they count that? I don't know. I'm making fun of that. I know somebody's got to figure that out. It doesn't make any sense, but they need to figure out why satellite can participate in this, and they say they can deliver over 100 by 20, and yet we don't have every single location served. Because unlicensed fixed wireless providers are now permitted to compete for Bead on a level playing field. States must account for BSLs with access to existing unlicensed fixed wireless networks to prevent overbuilding. So, this would be, and one of the problems with unlicensed is there's concerns about, you've got a lot of people using the same spectrum, right? So is this going to be reliable over time? So they try to mitigate that here in an appendix, but this is going to present, again, issues for states where they did not consider this. Now they got to take this into account. And what does this mean for, the other question I have is for like your nationwide 5G providers like T-Mobile, Verizon, I guess AT&T is doing some of that, where they have 5G service, and it's pretty good service. You can get that in a lot of areas. And is that considered served? Here in my area, I could get it for a while. Now I can't get it. Maybe I can get it again. I don't know. But the problem with it is there's limited spectrum. So somebody like T-Mobile might say, yeah, we'll sign you up. They'll sign you up, and then eventually they can't sign anybody else up. Or they might say, we can't sign you up now, but we can put you on a wait list. Well, that's not good, right? Because you've got to be able to get broadband service to somebody, within 10 days. So maybe that's part of what weeds some of these folks out, is that they can't provide it within 10 days. Or the problem is maybe they can today, but maybe they won't be able to once they start taking a lot of orders for this. So that's the problem. States must take the following steps to ensure that locations already served by unlicensed fixed wireless meet the technical specifications within Appendix A. I'll look at that a little bit. Before implementing the benefit of the bargain round, states must review the FCC's National Broadband Map to determine whether such a provider currently offers service to any BEAD-eligible BSLs in its jurisdiction. So they need to go back to the map and look for that. If so, the state must notify that provider that it has 7 calendar days to respond as to whether they want to submit evidence that BEAD funding is not required. It's had 7 days to respond to that provider that they intend to submit evidence that BEAD funding is not required for the location served. In other words, if there's an unlicensed fixed wireless operator in an area where before it was considered unserved, now they can come up and say, hey, it's served. We're here. It's unlicensed, but it's served. So again, this would be anything over 100 by 20 would be considered served. Therefore, not need funding. Upon receiving the response, the state shall allow the provider 7 calendar days to submit documentation supporting the claims. They got 7 days to say, it's served, 7 more days to document that. If the service provider demonstrates that it meets the requirements, the served locations will be ineligible for BEAD program funding. If the provider does not respond or fails to meet the requirements, then the locations will remain BEAD eligible. States must revise their list of eligible community anchor institutions to ensure their designations conform with the statutory definition of a community anchor institution as established by the IIJA. And they mentioned a couple of things about that. I won't get into it. Non-deployment funding. Funding for allowable non-deployment purposes is under review, and the NTIA will issue updated guidance in the future. As of the date of this policy notice, NTIA rescinds approval of all non-deployment activities approved in initial proposals. So maybe it's saying, we're rescinding it for now, maybe we'll give it back to you because it says that it's being under review. A state should consult with the NIST grants office in NTIA if the state believes that it is entitled to reimbursement for non-deployment activities costs. I didn't finish that there, but permitting. So here they're talking about how they're trying to make it easier to permit, to get these, permits done, and it talks about states have to use this environmental screening and permitting tracking tool. I won't go through that. Alignment with prior guidance talks about the unlicensed fixed wireless and LEO issues are now addressed in this policy notice. So there were a couple of additional guidances that were released, and they're saying these no longer apply because they're now covered in this new document. Modification of initial and final proposals. Any costs incurred by a state after this notice is published that do not apply with the terms of the notice may be disallowed. Further, NTIA hereby rescinds all final proposal approvals that occurred prior to the publication of this notice. So that would be Louisiana. Who else was there? Was Nevada? Can't remember. There were 3, I think. So those are rescinded as those final proposals no longer effectuate the goals of the program or the agency priorities that are detailed in this notice. In other words, the new administration. To comply with this policy notice, the authorized organization representative for each state must submit a letter to NTIA within 30 calendar days requesting an initial proposal correction to incorporate the terms of the policy notice into its initial proposal. So it sounds like they don't necessarily need to rewrite everything, but they need to have this this letter that incorporates the new things, I guess, maybe. A state may execute its modified subgrantee selection process once NTIA approves the initial proposal correction. So again, a really short time frame on this. States have basically 90 days to get all this in place and to get this new proposal in. Then the NTIA says they're going to turn everything around in 90 days. And when they do that, that would mean that funding would go to the states and the subgrantees before the end of the year. I still question that based on the questions I have in here and how the states are going to interpret all of this. So we'll have to see what happens. Then they've got the appendix for unlicensed fixed wireless service requirements. You can read through that. Again, I'll link to this. The appendix for low Earth orbit capacity subgrants. Basically, this is very confusing to me. You can read through that. Basically, in the unlicensed wireless spectrum, it's saying, it's noting the fact that, I think I updated this. Let me see if I'm going to have to go, yeah, let me see. Sorry, let me zip down here. See if that highlighted what I just did there. Yeah, it did. Yeah, so this is, yeah, back to this. So this is the unlicensed. So there were a couple of concerns, and one was interference. So again, with a unlicensed fixed wireless, you've got, there's no license fees, so anybody can use it. They can come in and use it. Something like CBRS spectrum, they were considering licensed by rule, where there were priority access licenses. There's no licensing fees on unlicensed, so anybody can go in there, and it's like they can use that. And if you got multiple people using it, then you've got multiple people using the spectrum, interference, those kinds of things. So they're saying that can be mitigated pretty easily, supposedly. And then, potential interference, there are different ways to do that. And then network capacity, network capability. Again, how much capacity is there if you've got a lot of people using this unlicensed spectrum? And then again, I bring up the same question about licensed spectrum from folks like T-Mobile and Verizon, where they don't have enough spectrum to connect everybody up in the area. Maybe they do. Maybe in an area like here in Atlanta, it's different. Maybe they don't have enough spectrum here in Atlanta because this is a huge area. Maybe in Gordon, Georgia, like I was showing you, if they put out 5G service there, maybe they have enough spectrum because there's fewer people that are going to need it. Maybe that's the case. I don't know, but that's still a question or concern for me. And that's then they got low Earth orbit. Again, I didn't understand what they were saying here. I'm not going to read through it. Talks about the reimbursements and how those are made. Does mention the clawback provisions. See, one concern I have is with satellite is how viable is this business? Right now, it's pretty viable because there are areas of the country that are unserved that had less than 25 by 3 or not much better than that, and people have satellite and they love the service. But once you deploy some better broadband there, then suddenly you're getting rid of those satellite customers. That is, unless satellite plays a big role in where you're deploying broadband in these areas as part of Bead, for example. So how viable business is it over 10 years if the needs of broadband, the needs that people have for broadband outgrow satellite, and there are other technologies that come in like fiber, so or even cable modem service. So that's one of the questions or the concerns I have about satellite broadband. So anyway, I don't know if there are any questions. I was unable to put the questions up today. I don't see anything, nothing in chat or anything like that. So there you go. Again, I kind of jumped the gun on this on Friday. I thought there was just a fact sheet, and then I was broadcasting. I said, oh, here's the document. I found it, went through it. I thought, oh, this isn't so bad. But as I looked through it further, it's like all kinds of questions came up. So we'll have to see in the upcoming days, and maybe some of that happened today. I was busy doing other things today, but maybe today some states came out. I know one state came out and said, how dare you? I forget who it was. They were very angry about the whole thing because they felt like a lot of their work, this was from a senator, I think, a lot of the work that their state did was now, no good any longer. So it'd be interesting to see, though, from the state broadband offices, how they handle this and what they say. Be interested to see other remarks from others in the industry. So that's all going to be happening. I'm making my remarks today. There's others that have said what they say. And there'll be more of that coming, and hopefully more clarification, again, on satellite and what that means as far as being able to participate now on a level field with fiber, but yet do they really deliver over 100 by 20, number one, because that's required, and number two, if they really deliver over 100 by 20, then why do we need to put anything anywhere? Because they already deliver over 100 by 20, and that's the threshold. If you're over 100 by 20, it's served. We don't need to spend the money there. That's what they say. Anyway, we really do need to spend the money there if we want people to be able to go far into the future with broadband service. If we're going to spend broadband dollars, we want to spend it not on something that's going to last a few years, but something that's going to go well into the future as far as the underlying infrastructure. So that's the big question I have. Appreciate you joining me. Thanks for doing that. Give me a like on the video if you liked it, and subscribe to our channel. You see right there, not here on the screen, but on YouTube. Go ahead and click subscribe. Ring the little bell, and you'll be notified when I'm live with something like this. Appreciate you joining me, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.